Thank you. So Cheryl Strayed, it's a great pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
How did you begin your day this morning?
My phone rang at 6:30 in the morning. I was in a hotel in Philadelphia, and a woman named Danielle said, "Good morning, Cheryl. I'm just checking in to make sure that you're awake."
And what did you and you said?
And I said, I didn't say, well, actually, I just flew from Portland, Oregon last night, and it's 3:30 in the morning, my time. But she was asking me if I was awake because I had to get up and go give a speech to 6,000 people this morning in Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania Women's Conference. So that's what I did.
6,000 people.
6,000 people.
And what did you tell 6,000 people? I mean, what does one tell 6,000?
I didn't tell them about Danielle. Only you got that. What I did is I stood up. It was interesting. I had to give a 30-minute speech.
Did it make you nervous?
I was nervous, but I decided not to be nervous, because what I've learned in these last many months that I've been talking so much publicly is that being nervous makes me more nervous, and then I get more nervous because I'm nervous, and you can tell I'm nervous, and so I just decided not to be nervous. So what I always do when I give a talk is I go up there with notes, and then I'm always too nervous to look down at the notes.
I have the same problem.
Do you do that?
I have these notes, and I know that they contain incredibly profound and good things, but I don't dare look at them, because if I look at them, I might not be spontaneous.
Right.
But I have them here.
But I'm going to give you some advice.
Please do. That really is quite surprising.
I know.
But yeah.
So I gave myself some advice, and I'm going to do this for you right now. And that is, my mission this morning was to spend 30 minutes essentially telling my story. And I know my story. I didn't have to read my notes. You know why you invited me here. You know what books I wrote and what we have to talk about tonight, because it's what you're curious about. It's what you're interested in. You don't need to call upon some text that you created.
So what is it that makes me feel? I think I'm taking advantage of a situation having you here and asking you these questions. But what is it about the necessity of having these notes here if I don't need them? I mean, I need your help.
I think it makes you feel. I think it makes you feel prepared. It makes you feel smart. You're imitating the people the scholars you've seen over all of your life.
Putting these little signs makes.
That's right.
You know that I have read you.
Right. That's right. But I'm telling you, trust your instincts. Follow your heart. You know what you have to say. You know what you're curious about. You know how to have a conversation with a writer, so let's just do it.
Let's just do it. Before we do it, as it were, tell me what were the 30 minutes about this morning?
What I decided to talk about was this idea of the journey, which sounds completely woo-woo and new age. I don't mean it that way. What I mean is that in Wild, in this book that just came out in March, I tell the story of a particular journey I took in my 20s, of my 1,100-mile hike on the Pacific Crest Trail when I was 26. And so I told the story of that journey, but I think that it's really just a small part of essentially the whole journey I've been on in my life as a woman and a writer. And so I told the story of that hike, and I also told the story of how I became a writer, how what I've done over the course of this past year, now that my writing has reached a wider audience than it ever had before, and what kind of sense I've made of the story so far.
The journey you've taken has recently increased your visibility amazingly.
Right.
And has possibly caused some rifts in your being. By becoming known,
right,
by becoming famous. Rainer Maria Rilke, who's someone I think you quote at some point, said that fame is but the collection of misunderstandings that gather around a new name.
That's right.
And I'm wondering, what fame has done to you, and how you will dig yourself out of fame.
of the hell pit that is fame. No, I'm teasing. I really think that mostly it's just been incredibly positive. I've spent my whole life, my whole adult life, really working on this thing, becoming a writer, becoming the sort of writer who would find an audience. And so I never really, and I said this morning too, I never set my sights on fame or being on the bestseller list or any of those things, because all of you in the room who are writers or artists of any sort know that sort of external recognition is not the measure by which artists can measure their success. The way we measure success, and often for artists, what looks like failure is often success. And that it takes a long time, really, to develop, that craft and to do anything even as simple as write a really bad book, let alone, truly, it's really hard to write even a bad book. It's a lot of work. And so, trust me, I know. No, and so I think that this fame thing, it feels, in some ways, thankfully, very much a part, separate from the work I've been doing all these years as a writer, and it's something that I, my job was to write the best book I could ever write at that moment in my life, and that's what I've done with all 3 of my books. And then the thing that happens to it in the world is really outside of me. But I think what you're talking...
But not completely.
But what you're talking about is then the piece of it where, to do that kind of work, to write that best book you can write, that's a very private process. That's a very solitary labor. And I think that the business of getting recognition for your writing, and I guess fame, is that you have to be very outside of yourself and not in that place that you're writing. And so I miss writing. I miss writing a lot. A lot of people who are fans of the Sugar column have said, when will you come back and write another column? And it isn't that I don't want to, it's that I don't have time to right now. I'm so busy talking about the column that I can't write it. It's true.
And here we are.
And here we are talking about it, yeah.
And you feel rather, I feel very liberated, by the way, for the moment, I have to tell you.
See, you're not looking at your notes.
Yeah, you did.
We should burn them right now.
You did. Well, it happened to me once. I was at a literary festival in Jamaica, of all places, in front of 1,500 people on the beach. And
really?
It's a fantastic place. Yeah. And I got on stage with the writer I was interviewing, and all the notes flew away.
Really?
Yeah. It was fantastic. It was
it's
great.
totally liberating.
And every 2 seconons, people in the audience would say, "Yeah, man.
Right.
Yeah, man." It
yeah,
was
man.
fantastic. It was really,
I think we can
yeah,
work
we need
something
"Yeah, man." Yeah, there you are.
What can we do? Yeah.
But I don't want to lose my train of thought. And what I was thinking about is how impatient you become with writers or people who want to write, whether they're writing good stuff or bad stuff, who feel that in some way the world owes them something. They feel entitled.
Right.
And there's one particular column which in some way has become,
an anthem.
Yes. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that column in particular.
Yeah. The column is called Write Like a Motherfucker.
And what does that... to my ears that were educated differently, what does that quite mean?
Oh my goodness. We could do the whole thing on the art of motherfuckitude.
Please.
Being a motherfucker, it's a way of life, really. And it really is encompassed in that column. I'm going to try to loosely quote myself. It's about having strength rather than fragility, resilience and faith and nerve and really leaning hard into work rather than worry and anxiety. The letter was by a woman, a young writer named Alyssa Bassist, who lives here in New York and is in the audience. And she wrote me a letter, wrote me as Sugar a letter, saying that she felt so uncertain and doubtful and full of anxiety and fear and self-loathing, and really was having a difficult time. She wanted to be a writer. She felt that burning thing in her that writers feel, and yet she felt paralyzed with anxiety. And she says at one point, I think you're
I'm
referring...
a pathetic and confused young woman of 26 and a writer who can't write.
And a writer who can't write. And I think there are a lot of writers who can't write, or they think they can't write. And essentially, my reply, what I tried to do was sort of shake her loose from herself. And I think in the letter, in my response, I say I understand that feeling. I think every writer has sometimes wrestled with those anxieties and that self-loathing. And yet, ultimately, in order to succeed in anything, we all have to, in essence, embrace humility. Rather, in some ways, what she was anxious about was not being successful at that age of 26. With not being, as she says in the letter, she says, David Foster Wallace was such a genius so young. Why am I not that way too? And what I said to her is, well, how hard have you worked? How much have you written? Have you even earned that right to ask that question yet? And so until you earn that right, you really can't lose yourself in that kind of anxiety. That in some ways, as I say in the letter, it has arrogance at its core.
Yeah, you say, do you know what it is? I love this. Do you know what it is? Sweet pea.
Sweet pea. Sweet pea. Sugar calls people sweet pea.
Sweet pea, yeah.
Yeah. I love that when I talk about
yeah.
sugar, I can speak of myself in the third person. And where did that come from?
Yeah.
Well, in my regular, normal Cheryl life, I do use a lot of terms of affection with people.
But sweet pea in
I call
particular.
people honey, and I know. But what I started to just do that as Sugar. It was like Sugar's thing. I decided that Sugar had to have a thing. And at first it was just natural, and then I realized I was doing it, and then I kept doing it. But what I want to say about this write like a motherfucker thing is that Alyssa has in common, many of the letter writers, I feel the same contradictory feeling, I guess, about them. And that is, I feel entirely sympathetic with their plight. And in many cases, I recognize myself, or sometimes an earlier version of myself, in those letters. And on the other hand, I feel like through that kind of lens of empathy and love, if you will, I can also tell them really how wrong they are, And in some ways, Alyssa was so wrong in her position of despair.
Do you think she understood you?
I know she did. You know why?
Why?
Because she has written like a motherfucker since then.
Let me, because I need a little more of an understanding than the one you've provided so far. What does it quite mean to write like
the motherfucker stuff. Okay.
Yeah, because I know I'm missing something by not understanding it fully.
Okay. Give me the book.
Yeah.
I think I sort of succinctly, but I'll expand on it. Okay. So first of all, I say to her, you have to get your ass on the floor and get to work. That really so
and
much.
That's a humility in
a
some
humility.
way. And you go through the etymology of the word humility.
Yes.
The notion that it comes from humus.
To be on the ground.
Humble, yes.
That's right. And I think a lot of people think being a motherfucker is being like some person who's the big dominant figure. But I actually think true motherfuckerhood. Now we're using so many variations of this term. It really has to do with being humble. And it's only when you can kind of get out of your own ego that you can actually do what's necessary to do in a relationship, in your professional life, as a parent, in any of those ways. And so I think that it has to do with humility, doing the work, but also, like I say, the unifying theme is resilience and faith. The unifying theme is being a warrior and a motherfucker. It's not fragility, it's strength. It's nerve. And if your nerve deny you, as Emily Dickinson wrote, go above your nerve. Writing is hard for every last one of us, straight white men included. Coal mining is harder. Do you think miners stand around all day talking about how hard it is to mine for coal? They do not. They simply dig. And so I think that being a motherfucker is digging really deep. And that has more to do with not just being on the ground, but finding what's beneath it. And I think that I mean that in a really big way, about how to live a life, how to maintain a long-time love, how to parent people, all of those things that you have to do, you have to go beneath the surface to find the truest thing.
But then writing like a motherfucker, to come back to that, means writing in a different way than
more honestly,
and stopping the complaint.
Yeah,
and stopping the whining.
That no more whining. Yeah.
Whining is not allowed.
Not allowed. No, because the thing is of course it's hard.
Writing?
Writing is hard.
Yeah.
Writing is hard for me all the time, every single time.
It doesn't get easier.
I've never written anything that it wasn't hard for me to write. And so it's just part of what we do, And so I think that focusing too much on it being hard, you're allowing yourself to get in the way of your real work.
Forgive me for looking at my notes for a second, but the reason I am is because in reading Writing Like a Motherfucker, I
love the way you say that. Could I put up my voicemail?
Yes.
Writing like a motherfucker.
Writing like a motherfucker.
It's so formal and nice. Yeah. Okay.
There is a letter that Elizabeth Gilbert has a letter on her website about the craft of writing.
Oh, okay.
And I'd like to read a little passage of
Sure.
it, particularly because she quotes Werner Herzog in a particular way about stopping to whine. And this is what she says. As for discipline, it's important but sort of overrated. The more important virtue for a writer, I believe, is self-forgiveness, because your writing will always disappoint you. Your laziness will always disappoint you. You will always make vows, I'm going to write for an hour every day, and then you don't do it. I will think I suck, I'm such a failure. I'm washed up. Continuing to write after that heartache of disappointment doesn't take only discipline, but also self-forgiveness, which comes from a place of kind and encouraging motherly love. The other thing to realize is that all writers think they suck. When I was writing Eat, Pray, Love, I had just as strong a mantra of "this sucks" ringing through my head, as anyone does when they write anything. But I had a clarion moment of truth during the process of that book. One day, when I was agonizing over how utterly bad my writing felt, I realized that's actually not my problem. The point I realized was this: I never promised the universe that I would write brilliantly. I only promised the universe that I would write. So I put my head down and sweated through it as per my vows. Here comes the punchline. I have a friend who's an Italian filmmaker of great artistic sensibility. After years of struggling to get his films made, he sent an anguished letter to his hero, perhaps, the brilliant and half-insane German filmmaker Werner Herzog. My friend complained about how difficult it is these days to be an independent filmmaker, how hard it is to find government grants, how the audience have all been ruined by Hollywood, and how the world has lost its taste, etc., etc. Herzog wrote back a personal letter to my friend that essentially ran along these lines. Quit you're complaining. It's not the world's fault that you wanted to be an artist. It's not the world's job to enjoy the films you make. And it's certainly not the world's obligation to pay for your dreams. Nobody wants to hear it. Steal a camera if you have to, but stop whining and get back to work. I repeat those words back to myself whenever I start to feel resentful, entitled, competitive, or unappreciated with regard to my writing. It's not the world's fault that you want to be an artist. Now get back to work. Always at the end of the day, the important thing is only and always that. Get back to work. This is a path for the courageous and the faithful. You must find another reason to work other than the desire for success or recognition. It must come from another place. Punto.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's so much, I've never heard that before, read that before, and it's so much, really echoes what I wrote to Alyssa in Write Like a Motherfucker. And I think it's the conclusion that any artist comes to eventually. And it's exactly what I was talking about a moment before when I said, with these books that I've written, what I tried to do was write the best book I could write. And I had to do what Elizabeth Gilbert really is talking about, and that is finally surrender to the idea that what I'm writing just might suck. And that I have no ability, essentially. It's not my work to judge what I've written, positive or negative. My work is to write it, and then come what may. I used to keep a journal pretty regularly, all through the sort of story of my day, until I had kids. My oldest is 8, and the minute he was born, the journal ends. It's, gave birth to 11-pound baby. No more journaling. But but before he came along, I finished my first book, which is a novel called Torch. And a few years ago, I was just looking through that old journal and reading it. And what's really interesting to me is if you didn't know that I had gone on, that novel pretty quickly after I wrote it was published, you would read my journal and you would think that I had written a book. You wouldn't know that I'd finished a book. Because every entry is really just how awful I am, how lazy I am, how much I didn't write, how the novel's never going to get done, what a failure I am, how nothing worked, how I had to delete 20 pages. It's all just a story of lament. The whole thing.
Do you still have
that? But meanwhile, I wrote a book.
Do you still have that?
I do. It's really fascinating. So there's the book, but here's the internal voice. This is the self-talk the whole while I was writing that book. And it was like I had to constantly berate myself because I always fell short of my vision of like how good I could be. As Liz says, I was always lazier than I should have been, and I was always, this or that or the other thing. But meanwhile, I was writing a book, and I did.
So
I wrote the book.
What's that about?
I think.
Because in the case of you, there are all these different voices. There's your nom de plume, your other nom de plume, the Cheryl Strayed, the
I
Sugar.
think there's just 2, right?
Just 2.
Yeah, okay.
But then there's just 2 that I know of. Yeah, you're right. But then there's also the chastising voice.
Oh, you mean, right.
And the accusatory voice.
Well, I think it's interesting. What's the ya man? Was that what they said in the Jamaican Writers Conference?
Yeah, man.
So say ya man if you are an artist of any sort and you relate to this kind of self-loathing pattern. Okay? And so I think it's human nature. And I think that the problem is that some people just get stuck there. So that whole time that I was lamenting, I was working my ass off and I wrote a book. And I think what happens is sometimes all they do is the lament, and then they're not actually doing the work, and then they get caught in that. It's kind of like being caught in this dysfunctional cycle in a relationship. You can't have any perspective. You can't see your way out of it. But I do think that for me it was actually in some ways this release in ways, to say, okay, I'm going to keep going even though I'm going to continue to experience difficulty in the face of this. In Wild, I write about moving forward in pain, moving forward in discomfort, moving forward with doubt and anger and insecurity and uncertainty and all of those things. And I think that what I've learned is that in just about everything I do that's even a little bit difficult, that even a little bit actually reflects what I'm really here to do, there is that doubt and anxiety, that discomfort is part of it. And so what you need to do is to learn how to work, outside that comfort zone. But you do need to work.
You need to work.
And that's being a motherfucker, is doing that.
I was struck when you were talking, a literary reference popped in my brain of Beckett. I can't go on, I will go on, I must go on.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sort of an impossibility to move and the necessity to move on. And you speak of the loss of your mother as having actually afforded you many possibilities that her presence might not have afforded you. I'm wondering if you can comment on that. It's quite painful to read, and yet you really believe it, I think.
Right. What it is really this mixed story. So for those of you who don't know, this piece of my life, when my mom was 45, she died very suddenly of cancer, and I was a senior in college at the time, and she was also a senior in college.
In the same college?
Well, yeah, we had gone to college together the first year. What had happened, so when I was, should I tell about how my mother and I went to?
Yes.
Okay. So when I was...
You can do whatever you want.
I grew up okay, I can do that. That's right.
Really?
Okay. So I grew up basically this poor country girl in northern Minnesota, and when it came time, when I was nearing the end of my high school years, I decided to apply to college, but I didn't even know that anyone should talk to me about college. I just thought, well, I'm just on my own, and so how I chose to apply, I got all these brochures in the mail, and I looked at the pictures, and the one that had the nicest picture is the one I applied to. I didn't know that I should apply to more than one. So I applied to this college called the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, and it's a private Catholic college that is mostly consists of business majors. So it couldn't have been, and I wasn't Catholic, I wasn't anything but I applied there and they let me in, and in the letter, when they accepted me, they said, your parents and your grandparents can take classes for free. And I'm pretty sure that what they mean by that is, they're thinking, somebody will take, Introduction to French or something. But no, my mother said, when we read this, she said, I've always wanted to go to college, and I knew that to be true. My mom had been a single mother and struggled mightily all through our lives, and really very heroically raised my siblings and me. And so at first, I said, well, you're too old to go to college. She was 40. Which is, when you're 17, 40 is way too old to go to college. And she agreed. And but what happened is, after a while, we had this conversation that really, we decided that she would go to college with me, which is the last thing on this earth I wanted to happen. But I also really loved my mom and wanted to give her a chance. And so I moved into the dorms in St. Paul, and my mom commuted 3 hours each way. And so we went to our freshman year in college together. We had an agreement that she could not acknowledge me if I did not acknowledge her, which is atrocious, I know. But I was, 18.
A reversal of roles also.
Well, it would just be, I would sometimes see my mother and I would just sail on by, because, she was this uncool old person. And I was, and so what happened is that first year, the school it's a fine school, but it wasn't a good fit for me. And so I transferred to the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. My mother transferred to the University of Minnesota in Duluth. And we went to college at the same time, and we got to know each other in a new way. So it was in our senior year of college she got what she thought was a bad cold. and quickly we found out it was advanced stage lung cancer, and she died 7 weeks later. And I would say that my first impulse, I'm getting back to your question, believe it or not, but you say that, as I've written, that in so many ways that loss has given me something. It also took away more than it gave, And what it took away was my mother. And that is something that I feel every day. There's the world without my mother. And there was the world with my mother, and that's like an ancient memory now in my life. And so what ultimately I decided to do, though, so my grief was just tremendous, and I didn't know what to do with that loss. And eventually what I figured out is that if my mother's life was going to mean anything, if everything that she had worked on in her life, which is essentially me and my brother and sister, that I was going to have to become this woman worthy of her. I was going to have to become this woman she raised, And so I threw myself into doing what I was most passionate about, and that is writing. And so everything that her absence has taught me, I pour right into that work. And everything her love gave me, I pour right into that work. And so that is what I mean when I say that loss has given me so much. That's what I mean.
You say quite poignantly, I have found it impossible to resist writing about my mother and her death.
That's right.
It's as if she occupies every available space.
She does, and what's interesting is I have this I've started another book. I've started a novel. I haven't been working on it so much lately, but I began it before Wild came out.
You have to begin working on
I
it
know.
like a motherfucker. You really
I know.
do.
I've got to be more of a motherfucker. But
you can't just tell other people to be motherfuckers.
I know.
Really.
I'm such a hypocrite.
Yeah, really.
So there is this novel that I've begun writing, and there's no dead mother. There's not even a speck of my mother in it, which is just amazing. And I'll be on this stage eating my words in 5 years, because you'll say, another novel about your mother. Because what happens is she keeps sneaking in. Those of you, how many have read Wild in the room? Okay. So when I first started writing Wild, I distinctly remember saying...
You can buy another copy afterwards, so...
I distinctly remember saying to my husband, I'm so glad I've finally started a book that has nothing to do with my mom. What was I thinking? I don't even know what I was thinking. It was like I was delusional. But I thought I was just going to somehow write about a hike that was not connected. But anyway, I swear this next novel, it's other people. It's not my mom. She's like, maybe the house they live in will be haunted. And it'll be the ghost of my mother. Till finally we can get her away.
Let's get to your 7 words.
Oh, my 7 words. Okay. So but these are the 7 words that I came up with that don't define me.
Yeah, you said you wrote to me 7 words that won't define me.
Right.
That's what
that
you
won't,
wrote.
Yeah.
And I'd love you to comment on some of them, all of them.
Okay.
Some of them were new to me. I had to look up what mahout was.
Mahout. Yeah, mahout does not define me. Do you know what a mahout is? A mahout is an elephant trainer.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not an elephant trainer for sure. Right? But it's my husband's favorite word.
Mahout.
Mahout. So what happened is
I'm just curious.
Do you want to know how this list was made?
I was just about to ask you.
I was on the train riding from Philadelphia, that speech, to here, and I was like, oh my God, I've got to do this. And so I texted my husband and asked him for 7 words. And
so these are not your 7 words?
No, they're mine. His were so dirty, I couldn't write them down.
I mean, we've used a few provocative words in the library tonight, but can you? What is it?
Oh,
no,
yeah.
no.
Trust me. If somebody has my cell phone, you could scroll back and read the text. But But
did they define you more, those dirty words that he had?
Yeah, on a good day, yeah. I mean, It was, depending on the. But mahout, I sort of did in my husband's honor because it is one of his favorite words. And so mahout is like somebody who trains an elephant. It's also somebody who rides an elephant.
Yeah.
And one time, several years ago, my husband and I went to Thailand, and we found ourselves riding elephants, and for a really long way. Like, we got on the elephant, and we thought it was just a sort of tourist experience, that we would just, ride the elephant. And I'll tell you this, it's fun for the first 15 minutes. And then, because at first you're like, I'm on an elephant. We're riding an elephant. This is so amazing, And then you're like, get me the fuck off of this thing.
So, one shouldn't mahout too long.
We went through the jungle, for hours. The elephants swimming through a river. There was it was like a nightmare of a elephant. We're doing the splits the whole time, too, because it's an elephant, It's
So, the other word...
So I'm not a mahout.
No, you're not a mahout. We know this now.
Yeah.
Bony.
Bony. I'm not bony. I've always wanted to be bony. I love bony. There's like those bony women. They're so pretty, and they look nice in jeans. And yeah, I'm not bony. Yeah.
Then you said reticent.
Reticent. Does it seem as if I'm reticent?
No.
I think that's self-explanatory.
Yeah, you did sum it up. And what's interesting is you're not reticent, and you accept.
That's right.
I think one of the
or bony. Both are fine. Yeah.
Bony, but reticent. What struck me in the word reticent is that you have accepted jobs willfully, for which you perhaps were not necessarily prepared.
That's right. Like a case in point.
Yes.
Dear Sugar.
Sugar. Yes.
That's right. Who am I to give advice?
Who are you to give advice?
Well, I thought about that a long time.
Yeah, tell me. Because
and I figured out...
Because I feel that I'm someone who would greatly benefit from advice. So
from my advice?
Maybe from your advice. So I'm just curious.
Well, why don't you get some advice?
Well, first tell me why you do feel you can give advice, and then based on your response, I'll see if I'll ask you for some advice.
Well, at first, my mind went to, I'd never written an advice column. I've never taken a class in psychology. I have no, education or licensure in counseling or any of those things. But then what I realized is, where have I, how have I received the most meaningful advice? And I would say that it really is through storytelling. Reading books, short stories and essays and novels and poems have been great solace to me in my darkest hours. And also really listening to, or seeking the loving kindness of people who really know how to listen and be compassionate and respond to you in this way that I call, in the Sugar column, unconditional positive regard. I have a few friends that pretty much anything I told them, they would listen to me with respect and love and counsel me about it. They would not bring themselves into the situation by being judgmental or condemning or any of those things. And so I realized that I could offer that as a writer, that I could tell stories that might enlighten. People come to me, they think they have this one little situation, and you see this over and over again in the column, where we go from the situation that's been presented to me, and then in my column, what I do is I take that situation and I tell a bigger story about it. And I do that so that letter writer can really see him or herself with a bigger and brighter and wider and deeper perspective. And so often people will read the letters and say, well, at first I thought, this didn't apply to me because, I'm not attracted to elephants, for example. And it turns out your answer, was all about something that was relevant in my life. And so I try to answer, I try to take a specific situation and tell a universal story about it. And that's what novelists do, that's what short story writers do, that's what essayists do, that's what literary writers do. And that, it just so happens, is what I've been doing for the last 20 years. And so I offered that. I offered being a writer to my readers.
You offered what you've called and what the editor Rumpus called radical empathy.
Right. I didn't call it that. He called it that.
He called it that.
Steve
yeah.
Allman, yeah.
Yeah. What do you think he meant quite?
I think he's probably using that word radical, by its actual meaning. I think so often we think that word radical means fringe or on the outside, but it actually means the root, the original.
The first. Primal.
The primal.
Radix. Really.
That's right. And
going down. I mean, not far removed, by the way. I mean, we could make a bridge between radical and humility.
That's right. And so I think what I offer, that when you really care about somebody genuinely, you can both love them and tell them the truth. And so I was able to say to Elizabeth, and she was also able to hear me saying, I love you, I believe in you, I have high regard for you, and you're kind of being a lazy whiner, and get over yourself. And that sort of ability to be candid while also not being condemning, I think that's radical empathy. And I mean, think about the things that you are the most ashamed of that you've done. We all have something.
This is where we begin now.
We're turning now to you.
Yeah,
We all have those things that we've done in our lives that we are the most ashamed of.
And continue to be.
And one of the things, and I get to ask this over and over again, how can you, I've written about those things, okay? I've written about those things in my life. How can you do that? Aren't you afraid of being judged? And a lot of writing students who are writing memoir will say that. I can't tell this because everyone will hate me. They'll think I'm this or that or the other thing. And my experience has been, with all the writing I've done about all the things I've done wrong, I've gotten maybe 3 emails that say, you're a stupid slut. And I've gotten probably now about 30,000 emails saying thank you. And what I mean by that is that people will actually love you if you tell them who you are, if you actually, truly tell them who you are. And we all know who you are. Somebody who has done something shameful, somebody who has made mistakes, And that's not the only thing you are. It's not the only thing you have to offer. But when you allow people to see who you really are in a whole way, people will love you because they recognize themselves. So I think that's what radical empathy is being able to listen to that and receive it.
But the word empathy itself, I mean, to really be able to feel someone else's pain.
That's right. I've always been, I've always been that way. I think writers are, maybe, right? We put ourselves in other people's.
Porous. I mean, and to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, however uncomfortable those shoes are, however much they don't fit. I mean, this is where I've always found that identity politics are just ridiculous. I mean, why want to, just understand yourself and read about yourself rather than something quite different, which might take you back to yourself, which leads me to your columns, which seem so often circuitous and digressive, and yet come back. They come back to something both universal and very particular.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm wondering about you as giving advice, and whether to ask for it. But before I do,
who do you go to for advice? Your wife?
Well, yes. I mean, for instance, it was upon reading your column as collected in the book that she very strongly urged me to invite you tonight.
I'm glad she did. Thank you so much. I'm glad she did.
No. So
thank you.
And so in order to save my marriage, I decided it would be a good thing. So yes, I do. I'm not sure, I think the biggest issue I have, Sugar, is that I'm not sure I seek enough advice.
Well, that's what I was going to say. You seem to have issues just with this, with this idea of, when I asked you who you go to for advice, you seemed even at a loss about that, which is interesting.
What is that about?
No, I think you're hiding
what
something from yourself.
Pardon?
But I think you're hiding something from yourself.
I think so.
But we probably shouldn't get into that.
No, I'd like to get into it a little bit because I think I know the origins of words like empathy. I also know that I detest with a passion people who say something that goes something like this, which you do not do, thankfully. Because if you did, regardless of what my wife would have said, I wouldn't have you here, which is people who give you unsolicited advice.
Yes.
I have that very much in my family.
I was just going to say that. I knew it was somewhere back there, that you have a negative association with people telling you what to do.
Yes.
But that's not what advice is.
Well,
good advice is not
I
that.
adore my parents. I have a father who turned 94 today.
Oh, happy birthday.
I have a mother who's 88, so together they're 182. They've been married as of last month 69 years.
Wow.
Incredible, no?
That is incredible.
When my father knows I've been married for 14, he feels like I've just scratched the surface.
It's probably true.
It's nothing very much. But my father is, I think here we're getting to it. I have this for you. In the more composed letter that I write to you, it will be part of it. But he's hard of hearing. So because he's hard of hearing, I've had to learn how to enunciate, which has helped me in my current position. But he doesn't hear. Therefore, the advice he gives to me can be very often erroneous because he hasn't, he hasn't heard what I have to say. But this is not quite what I know it's complicated and digressive, but
This is just like a sugar column, actually.
Isn't it? But what I was going to get to is rather this, which is people who say to you, which I don't think you do, I know exactly how you feel.
Right.
Which to me is not empathy.
Right, it's claiming a territory that maybe only you can occupy, right?
And it's claiming also as if you knew what it is I'm experiencing.
Right.
Which may not be at all truthful. Mm-hmm. Now, I'd like to come back to your idea of candor. Mm-hmm. Candor and love. And the possibility, because the great. I'm sorry again. This is a disease I suffer from, which is quotomania. La Rochefoucauld, an 18th century moralist, 17th century, maybe 17th century moralist, said that if people knew what everybody thought about, nobody would talk to anybody. Something like that, not quite. But you don't believe that at all. You believe actually, let's get it out there. And let's not only get it out there, but let's give what I might call your columns to stand for, which is really tough love. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that tough love and why you actually think it is valuable, important now. Well,
I think, and I will say, I do think I give really direct and tough advice as sugar, but I would say that the absolute first virtue in the sugar columns, in the thing that I hope more than anything that I pass on to my children, that's the most important value, isn't candor, it's kindness. Now, I think it's more important to be kind than anything. But what I think is so often kindness and honesty have been put on these opposite sides. We think that if we tell someone the truth, that's somehow cruel. And I think that there's a way to be honest about yourself and honest about others, especially in this situation where I'm being, people are asking me, what do I think? What do I think about their husband who's been unemployed for 6 years and they resent it? And what do I think about, the friends who got busted talking about their other friend, or any number of situations that I write about in Tiny Beautiful Things?
archetypal situations? Are there a few situations? I mean, can our problems be boiled down to some situations, and you have in your mind perhaps a repertory of situations?
Yeah, there are really just like 4 problems.
Okay.
Essentially. Are we going to make a chart?
I'm just going to write them down so that I can.
Okay.
No, but tell me.
Okay, let's see if I can kind of think. Okay, so one is somebody I love. Did somebody just raise their hand? Okay, what was the thought? Right.
Okay.
Right. People are really so they're asking me what I think, and I think that what I'm trying to say is there's a way to be loving. I mean, and you see it. I mean, I guess it's the way I've come up with doing that. And when I give my advice as Sugar, is I don't think every once in a while a reader will say, "Oh, I think you were too harsh," in that reply. But usually people don't think I've been too harsh, even when I've been honest. And I'm really glad about that because it matters to me. And it's been something that I think that it has to do with, so often honesty, when it's cruel, it also contains things like judgment, condemnation, anger, some sort of chip on your shoulder. You're being honest from a place that actually is pretty dishonest, or you're being honest in a context that's completely fucked up, Like if your friend says, "Am I fat?" and you look at her and you think, well, in this cultural context, yes, you are fat. But what you really think is this culture is messed up when it comes to women and their bodies. And so let's have a conversation about that. Let's talk about a deeper answer to that question. And I think that there's a way to I guess, embrace, this kind of cruel version of the truth, and then the kinder, more human, and more humane version of the truth. It's a very intangible thing. It's hard for me to describe, except just, I guess, show examples in the book. But I guess that's what I mean to say. I don't believe in that kind of brutal honesty stuff. I think that's
It's
terrible.
interesting also, I want to come back to the 4 problems, but the word kindness seems so interesting to me because it's so often in our culture considered a rather weak virtue.
Yeah, they're wrong.
They're wrong.
Yeah. I mean, really, think about that. Think about how hard it is to be kind when you don't want to be, or when somebody doesn't deserve it, or when somebody has been unkind to you. I mean, you're driving down, you're driving and somebody cuts you off, and what if you don't have a fit about it? Like how much better will your life be if you flip the person off rather than if you don't, And I think that so often we think that like anger is going to give us power and control, and actually kindness does. When you can sort of make yourself bigger rather than smaller.
And kindness has a relationship also with empathy
Absolutely.
Because the word itself means being of kin.
Yeah.
In some way.
Well, we are all kindred. Kindred
yeah.
is one of my favorite words. Yeah, that kindred quality among us. Yeah. So the 4 problems to keep up. This is I would say, and I just grabbed that number 4 off the top of my head, but I would say, so one if I put the letters in the 4 stacks, it would be someone who was central to my life or essential to my life died, and I don't know what to do with my grief. That's one category. And there are a lot of people like that.
A lot of them write to you.
A lot of them write to me, yeah.
And you have passages in the book where you speak about the impossibility of really getting over that.
Yeah. Well, it's possible to get over it. It's just that it will always be with you too, And again, I think that there's a difference between the model of thinking the way we get over something is to purge it rather than to figure out a way to carry it with us with grace, And I think that that's a subtle but important difference, I would say the other category is essentially I love someone and I'm cheating on him or her, or he or she has just cheated on me. The whole like, monogamy, sex, not being, faithful, kind of, that's a whole category in its own. And I have a lot of letters from people like that. Surprising stories. And what else? What the hell am I going to do with my life? Woe is me. Do you know woe is me is the oldest sentence in the English language that's still in use, that's never gone out of use.
What is the what?
Woe is me. Woe is me. And I teach writing, and I started doing this writing exercise where I just wrote woe is me on the chalkboard, and I would say, okay, write for 30 minutes something that has to do with woe is me. And it's like the one exercise that like nobody's ever stuck. Everyone's just like, oh my God. Everyone is just feels so sorry for them. I mean, they have no problem. They could there's no problem coming up with, what they have woe about. So there's a reason, right? Woe is me is a whole huge category, right? And what else? Oh, then there's the whole like, what the hell am I going to do with my kids? And, I love them and they've completely messed my life up. And, that whole, should I have them? Should I not have them? Like all of those parenting.
I imagine now 4 stacks. Are there 4 stacks?
Yeah.
They are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, no, they're all on my computer. My laptop's in the back room. We could pull it out and start reading some letters. But
yeah. when these letters come, I mean, you get.
I have thousands of letters, yeah. I read them. They're interesting and beautiful and sad and maddening and all of those things. They're really beautiful. I could just publish a whole book of the letters without my replies and you'd all be really interested in reading them. Because they really tell the story of what it means to be human today in our times. So
I'm curious about the process. You get a letter, you obviously have to make a selection.
Yeah, it's very haphazard. I mean, I read letters and I just decide what is interesting to me, what I feel like I have something, if I have something to say about what I've been asked.
They keep you up at night.
They do keep me up at night. I'm haunted by several of them, and I also try to make the column really diverse. From the beginning, I didn't want Dear Sugar to just be a love and sex and relationship column. I wanted it to be about work and about aging and about parenting and about dysfunctional families and about everything. And so I've tried to really answer questions of all sorts. Yeah.
Because I was curious upon reading them, how do you compose an answer? How do you answer?
I think
how
about
do you answer and who? And sometimes you also say to yourself, "Who am I to answer?"
No, I stopped doing that. I'm sugar, honey.
Okay.
Well, I mean, the reason I gave myself permission to answer too is because I'd let go of what you were talking about, that superior notion of I'm giving you advice and I know what you should do, and I'm not the know-it-all. Like, I'm not positioning myself as the know-it-all. I'm positioning myself as someone who is willing to strap on the plunking gear, whatever. I've never gone plunking. Is that you go into the cave? Splunking. So that's one of my words too. I'm not a plunker or splunker or whatever. But going down into the dark places with that person. I say, come on, let's go down there. And I do not know what I'm going to say.
Discover.
I really, truly write the sugar column exactly like I've written anything else. It's just the exact same way when I said, Wild isn't about my mom at all. Well, what happened is I started writing Wild, and Wild was absolutely about my mom. And I learned that because I wrote it. And writing is an act of discovery and unveiling and constant sort of taking oneself deeper. And that happens with sugar too. And so that experience you're talking about where you say, it digresses and then we go around and then we land where we began. What you're witnessing there is the art of writing and the act of writing is that I am doing those gymnastics because that's the only way that I can come to the answer, to the best answer that I have to offer, is by going on that exploration. So that's what I do.
And that exploration in Wild was an exploration that was tremendously physically difficult. You've said that it was the hardest thing you've ever done.
Right, physically, yeah. It was tremendous. I mean, I went on this hike thinking that I would...
20-some years ago.
I'm not that old.
18 years ago.
17 years ago.
17 years
Okay,
ago.
I was 26. It was the summer of 1995, and I walked these 1,100 miles of the Pacific Crest Trail by myself.
With a very heavy backpack.
With an incredibly
Monster.
heavy backpack that I call Monster. That was my nickname for the backpack. And, I get out there, and every single thing about it was hard. And, I mean, before I even got out there, I bought all this stuff. I had never gone backpacking before. I'd gone hiking before. But I buy all this stuff, and I'm about, day one of my hike. I pack all of this stuff I've bought into my pack, and I can't lift my pack. I can't lift it. I'm in an air-conditioned motel room in the town of Mojave, California, and I can't lift that pack. And I have to carry it 1,100 miles through the wilderness. And, there is I was in a pickle. I was in a real pickle. And the thing is that I had to lift it. And I think that a lot of people who write to Sugar, and maybe that's how I pick the letters, is that every once in a while, probably a few times over the course of our lives, we are at that place where we cannot do what we absolutely must do. And there is nobody there. There's nobody there who's going to get you out of that place except yourself. And that is exactly what Wild is about. And I think it's also what Tiny Beautiful Things is about. And that is how to bear the unbearable. And I had to do that in a really literal way with my pack. And I had to do it in every single way during that time of my life with the world without my mother. How did I bear the world without my mother? And so that is the journey I went on in Wild. And the way that I learned how to do that was actually physically enacting, physically bearing what was unbearable. And I think I knew that in an intuitive way at the time that it was happening, but it was years later when I went on that journey as a writer, when I said, well, the reason I said when I started writing Wild is that the book wasn't about my mom, is I thought I was going to write a book about hiking, and I didn't know what writing a book about hiking meant. And then I started writing a book about it, and then I understood what it meant. I did it like a motherfucker. I went to that deeper place, I think.
In Torch, you have this epigram, yes, it would be your duty to bear it if you could not avoid it. It is weak and silly to say you cannot bear what it is your fate to be required to bear, which comes from Jane Eyre.
That is so wonderful. I never ever put that together. So that is in my first book. That's what the opening quote in my first book from Jane Eyre, which is one of my favorite books of all time. It would be your duty to bear what it is your fate to be required to bear. And how interesting, I just told you that story. It wasn't conscious for me, but it was clearly present, because by the time I wrote Torch, I had taken that hike. I'd gone through that experience. And I'd come to that understanding that it would be silly to say you cannot bear what you're required to bear. So I knew it in some way. Yeah.
There was a long hiatus between the writing of Wild and the hike.
Right.
Why?
Because it takes a long time to become a writer. I was 26 when I finished hiking that trail, and I had a lot of work to do before I could learn how to write a book. And the book that I had burning in me to write was Torch, was my first book. And I couldn't really I couldn't think about telling any other story except that story that I told in Torch. It was really, sort of burning in my bones in many ways. And so I went through my 20s being a waitress and writing, and then I went to graduate school. And it was there at Syracuse University that I really began writing Torch. And once Torch was finished and published, I had 2 kids under the age of 2. And that's when I thought, well, what's the next story? And that ended up being Wild. But I didn't really think I was ever going to write about the hike until I did. It wasn't an experience I took so that I could write a memoir about it. It was a life I lived that I decided had a story, that I had a story that I could tell. You know?
It's interesting, your response to the Jane Eyre quotation. Because in some way I'd like to, in closing, address this with you, is the transformative quality of that trip that you didn't know you would write about, and the deeply transformative and nearly tactile effect that literature, you were talking about storytelling, but literature, and certain literature in particular, has upon you. I'm thinking particularly of your love of a particular poem of Adrian Rich, Power. Do you know it by heart, by the way?
You know, I know it roughly.
Try.
But I know now I'm nervous. I can't think of it. If I were
Listen,
drunk, I could do it.
You're not. No. Just let me remind you that you're not nervous. Remember?
Can I just? So I can paraphrase the reason I love that poem
I'll
so
do
much.
this for you.
Okay. The reason. Do you want me to read the whole poem?
Yes.
Okay.
It's quite, and you might contextualize it. You write about it beautifully, so
Right.
I'd like you.
So as I said, I get out there to that motel room in Mojave, and I pack that pack that I can't lift, and I get that pack attached to me, and it's tremendously heavy. It's ridiculously heavy, and I go and I start hiking on the trail in the Mojave Desert, which is really these mountains that are like desert mountains, and I hiked maybe 3 miles that first day, and it was just absolutely devastating physically. I was just exhausted. And the wind was howling, and I realized that I was absolutely in very deep, that I had gotten myself into something that was much bigger than me and much harder than I expected, and that pretty much anything I expected was nullified, that the whole thing was going to be what I didn't expect. And one of the many things in my pack was a book of poems called The Dream of a Common Language by Adrian Rich. And it had been given to me by my friend, the writer, Gretchen Legler, right after my mother died. And in those years after my mom died, I'd read those poems over and over. They were consoling to me and healing to me and enlivening to me. And so I decided I carried that book with me the whole way on my hike.
Is it one of the books you...
Yeah, I didn't burn it. I carried it the whole way. It's a book.
You have a list of books that you burned. You have a footnote here where you say not burned, carried all the way.
That's
not
right.
burned, traded for the novel.
Yeah, some books I would trade, and so they wouldn't get burned. So those of you who haven't read the book, please know. I mean, when it comes to book burning, it's like Hitler, Mussolini, Pol Pot, and me. But just trust me that I burned them with more love than those guys did. So that first day I hiked 3 miles, which was absolutely pathetic because it wasn't far. But yet I was like, I can't go further because I was just too exhausted. And the wind is howling, and all I want to do is run away and hide. And there's no place to run, just with myself. And I pitch my tent, and I crawl into my tent, and it's just like a haven. And what I do, I really should be taking out my guidebook or taking out my book that will tell me how to use a compass, because I don't know how to use a compass at this point. And instead, what I reach for is The Dream of a Common Language. And I read the first poem in the book. And I've always read out loud to myself. I always read my own work out loud to myself many times. But I read this poem out loud to myself several times. Power. Living in the earth deposits of our history. Today, a backhoe divulged out of a crumbling flank of earth. One bottle, amber, perfect. 100-year-old cure for fever or melancholy. A tonic for living on this earth in the winters of this climate. Today, I was reading about Marie Curie. She must have known she suffered from radiation sickness, her body bombarded for years by the element she had purified. it seems she denied to the end the source of the cataracts on her eyes, the cracked and suppurating skin of her finger ends, till she could no longer hold a test tube or a pencil. She died a famous woman denying her wounds came from the same source as her power. And I would say that those last lines I read over and over, I think that they are essentially everything that Adrienne Rich's career was about, and everything that my career has been about, is that Adrienne Rich was not a woman who died. You know, she died actually back in April of this year. She did not die a woman who denied that her wounds came from the same source as her power. In fact, she spent her life making power from those wounds. And I think that that is, you know, her writing about Marie Curie, who obviously was a trailblazer for both of us, you know, as women. And Marie, she didn't have that luxury. She had to deny that in order to be who she was in her time. But we don't. And I think that in so much of the work I've done as Sugar and Wild, and really the work I hope to continue to do, is about writing into those wounds. Thanks.
One other passion of yours, literary passion, transformative passion, someone who's mattered to you tremendously and who you've had occasion to meet, and you might talk about that meeting and that non-meeting in some way, is Alice Munro.
Right. Alice Munro.
She matters to you so deeply.
She does.
So dearly.
How many of you love Alice Munro? Yes, she's such a wonderful writer, and
you wrote to her. She wrote to you.
Right. Do you have here?
I do.
So when I was a little 22, 23-year-old whippersnapper, I wrote a short story, and I entered it in a contest. It was the first time I had, sent a story out to a contest. And I got this call one day and was told that my story won. And the man on the phone said, I'm going to send you, it was going to be in this anthology because it won this contest. I'm going to send you 2 copies, one for you and one for your mom. And my mom was dead by then, and I realized, and he said, oh, that's what they always do. They always, that's why a literary journal, when you're they send you 2 copies, one for you and one for your mom. And when he said that to me, the first thing I thought is, I didn't have a mom to send it to, but the person who had been my mentor without even knowing about it was Alice Munro. I had studied her stories, I'd read her stories, I had recognized myself in her work. And so I did this ridiculous thing I'd never done before. I wrote a fan letter, and I sent her the book, and I explained to her, that, and I meant this really sincerely, that she didn't have to read it. She just had to, I just wanted her to have it. But what happened is within just, I think something like 3 weeks after I sent it, I checked my mail, and there was a letter from Alice Munro. It said this: Dear Cheryl, your letter and story were forwarded to me here in BC, where I'm staying until April, near to 2 of my daughters and my 1 grandchild. I want to say that I was moved and delighted by the horse and blue canoe. That's my story. It was actually called The House with the Horse and the Blue Canoe, but I'm going to let Alice know.
How generous.
It's a wonderful, unexpected kind of story, and I wouldn't change a hair on its head. That's what my favorite editor always says to me before he proposes about 50 changes. You are quite right to stay out of academic life if you can. Are you eligible for any grants? If you were in Canada, I'd certainly urge you to apply for one from the Canada Council. You must continue writing, but you do have lots of time. You're 2 years younger than my youngest daughter. I wasn't writing nearly so well at your age. With great good wishes, Alice Munro.
Isn't it extraordinary also that now you You have become the recipient of these letters.
I know. It's there. I mean, and that is. I mean, I've given to a lot of, younger writers, and I do feel that there's this obligation we have. We sort of pass along the generosity that we've received, and certainly she was so generous in that. And I never have met Alice Munro. I had the opportunity to meet her.
Yeah, and you didn't.
In this very city. So what happened is, I was reading her stories. She wrote to me. I never replied to her because I felt like I didn't want to take advantage of her in any way. I was sure that she was receiving thousands of letters, and she didn't want another one from me. So I just took that letter into my heart, and I kept reading her stories and kept being her biggest fan and kept learning from her. I would study her sentences and imitate them in my own writing by a way of trying to write myself, to try to teach myself how to write. And years passed, and I came to live in Syracuse, New York, when I was in graduate school. And the New Yorker was having their New Yorker festival, and they had Alice Munro, who really rarely does readings. And I bought a ticket, and I took the train from Syracuse, and I went and saw her. And when she walked on stage, I just began to weep, just seeing her. I mean, I've never had that feeling about anyone before or since, that I just started crying. And in that essay, it's called Monroe Country, I say it's like I finally understood all those girls in the 60s who would start shrieking when they saw the Beatles, That's how I felt. And I couldn't get a hold of myself. And afterwards, there was a signing, and I waited to the end of the line because I wanted to be able to talk to Miss Munro, but as the line crept closer, I kept saying to myself, you're ridiculous. What are you going to say to her that not everyone else has said? She's just, and so I realized she was just meant too much to me. I couldn't possibly communicate to her how important she was to me, and also how, in order to have my own life and my own writing career, I needed to kind of let her go. Like I needed to loosen my grip on her in some ways too. So I got to her, and she looked up at me, and just before I was going to approach, I just waved, and I left. And so the next contact I had with her was through our agents when I had to get her permission to write that letter, and she read the essay, and so it was. What's really interesting to me is I don't think I've had one signing in the last 9 months that at least one person hasn't come up to me and said, I feel just like you did in your essay, where I don't know what to say because I know everyone else has said it before. And what I say to them, which is true, and I'm sure Alice Munro felt this too, is it always matters. Even if people have said it many times before, it matters. It would have mattered to her. I regret not saying to her, thank you, and I love your work, because it always does matter to a writer, I think. And, I wrote the essay instead.
Well, tonight, the audience here present will have the occasion, I hope all of them, to have their book signed by you and to meet you. There may be somebody in this audience who will simply wave at you.
Yeah, if you wave, it's okay.
In closing, and this we did, it's the only thing we've prepared tonight, is for you to read the very last letter from Tiny Beautiful Things. It's a letter you write to yourself. Shall I read the letter you write to you, and then you read the response?
I didn't write this.
No.
This was from a person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you read this.
So do you want to read this
No,
part?
that's what I meant. Yes.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is I received that
right.
from a stranger. Right.
So here is what
the letter writer.
The letter writer seeking wisdom writes to you.
Yes.
I read your column religiously. I'm 22. From what I can tell by your writing, you're in your early 40s. My question is short and sweet. What would you tell your 20-something self if you could talk to her now? Love, seeking wisdom.
Okay. Dear seeking wisdom, stop worrying about whether you're fat. you're not fat. Oops, I'm leaving my sound thing behind, sorry.
Yeah, let me.
Here we go. Stop worrying about whether you're fat. You're not fat. Or rather, you're sometimes a little bit fat, but who gives a shit? There is nothing more boring and fruitless than a woman lamenting the fact that her stomach is round. Feed yourself, literally. The sort of people worthy of your love will love you more for that, sweet pea. In the middle of the night, in the middle of your 20s, when your best woman friend crawls naked into your bed, straddles you, and says, "You should run away from me before I devour you," believe her. You've all had that friend too. You are not a terrible person for wanting to break up with someone you love. You don't need a reason to leave. Wanting to leave is enough. Leaving doesn't mean you're incapable of real love or that you'll never love anyone else again. It doesn't mean you're morally bankrupt or psychologically demented or a nymphomaniac. It means you wish to change the terms of one particular relationship. That's all. Be brave enough to break your own heart. When that really sweet but fucked up gay couple invites you over to their cool apartment to do ecstasy with them, say no. There are some things you can't understand yet. Your life will be a great and continuous unfolding. It's good you've worked hard to resolve childhood issues while in your 20s, but understand that what you resolve will need to be resolved again and again. You will come to know things that can only be known with the wisdom of age and the grace of years. Most of those things will have to do with forgiveness. One evening, you will be rolling around on the wooden floor of your apartment with a man who will tell you he doesn't have a condom. You will smile in this spunky way that you think is hot and tell him to fuck you anyway. This will be a mistake for which you alone will pay. Don't lament so much about how your career is going to turn out. You don't have a career. You have a life. Do the work. Keep the faith. Be true blue. You're a writer because you write. Keep writing and quit your bitching. Your book has a birthday. You don't know what it is yet. You cannot convince people to love you. This is an absolute rule. No one will ever give you love because you want him or her to give it. Real love moves freely in both directions. Don't waste your time on anything else. Most things will be okay eventually, but not everything will be. Sometimes you'll put up a good fight and lose. Sometimes you'll hold on really hard and realize there's no choice but to let go. Acceptance is a small, quiet room. One hot afternoon during the era in which you've gotten yourself ridiculously tangled up in heroin, you'll be riding the bus and thinking about what a worthless piece of crap you are, when a little girl will get on the bus holding the strings of 2 purple balloons. She'll offer you one of the balloons, but you won't take it because you believe you no longer have a right to such tiny, beautiful things. You're wrong. You do. Your assumptions about the lives of others are in direct relation to your naive pomposity. Many people you believe to be rich are not rich. Many people you think have it easy worked hard for what they got. Many people who seem to be gliding right along have suffered and are suffering. Many people who appear to you to be old and stupidly saddled down with kids and cars and houses were once every bit as hip and pompous as you. When you meet a man in the doorway of a Mexican restaurant who later kisses you while explaining that this kiss doesn't mean anything because much as he likes you, he's not interested in having a relationship with you or anyone right now, just laugh and kiss him back. Your daughter will have his sense of humor. Your son will have his eyes. The useless days will add up to something. the shitty waitressing jobs, the hours writing in your journal, the long meandering walks, the hours reading poetry and story collections and novels and dead people's diaries, and wondering about sex and God and whether you should shave under your arms or not. These things are your becoming. One Christmas, at the very beginning of your 20s, when your mother gives you a warm coat she saved for months to buy, don't look at her skeptically after she tells you she thought the coat was perfect for you. Don't hold it up and say it's longer than you like your coats to be, and too puffy, and possibly even too warm. Your mother will be dead by spring. That coat will be the last gift she gave you. You will regret the small thing you didn't say for the rest of your life. Say thank you. Sugar.
Thank you, Cheryl Strayed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That was great. That was great. You're awesome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.